Welcome all. I am Batia Wiesenfeld. I'm the director of the Business and Society program at Stern, and I'm so happy to have here with me today John Haidt and Alison Taylor to kick off the introductions in just a moment, but to kick off the first of 3 webinars in our BSP Spring series focused on navigating the new order, sort of what's going on with these changes that we're seeing with the new administration and with democracy. We can introduce, so we will be recording all of these sessions. They will all be available on the BSP website, so feel free to come back for any recordings. And I'm so happy to have both John Haidt, who's Tom Cooley Professor of Ethical Leadership and one of my colleagues in BSP, and Alison Taylor, who's the Executive Director of Ethical Systems and also an adjunct professor here at Stern. So just to get us started, the impetus for this in part was the events of less than 2 weeks ago when we saw something that no one ever thought we would see in America, rioters storming the US Capitol, something that we are maybe more accustomed to seeing in developing countries, in places where you assume that the government is less stable. And I'm wondering, John, how did we get here? And as a political psychologist, what do you see as the underlying causes of these events? Where did it start and where is it taking us?
Okay, sure. Well, I'll start by saying thank you, Batia, for having the idea for doing this. I think we're all trying to figure out what's going on and what implications this has for organizations and leaders. I'll also say that I've been studying political psychology and polarization since 2004. I used to study how morality varied across cultures, but by 2004, it was clear that left and right were becoming like different countries, and it's gotten so much worse since then. So the story, there's a lot of threads to the story. A lot of things come together, but if you keep your eye on, there's really 3 main threads here, I think, that we have exploded recently. So the first is rising affective polarization. So political scientists used to argue about whether we're actually getting polarized because on issues, we're not actually coming apart, like on abortion and other issues. It actually hasn't changed that much. But if you look at how people feel about the other side, that's what has changed. And so if you look at the degree to which people hate the other side or see them as a danger to the republic, those numbers were pretty stable from the 70s through the 90s. And they weren't that negative, actually. It's surprising, even through Bill Clinton's first term. But they begin rising in the late 90s, and then they really speed up in the 2000s and particularly in the last 4 years. So that's one, is that we hate each other more. So that's like the drive, the passion, the fire. The second one is changes to the media environment. Those are absolutely critical because what people don't seem to remember is that newspapers and the media were always partisan and full of conspiracy theories and really low standards. There was just this one period in the mid to late 20th century where we had really professional journalism and we had only 3 networks and they had the fairness doctrine. So anyone on this call only remembers the post-war period where we had really high standards of journalism, but that was the anomaly. Once cable TV comes in, the fairness doctrine is removed, you get narrowcasting, not broadcasting. And it's not until the 90s you get Fox News really perfects the craft. And so Fox News is extremely important in this story. Fox News and right-wing media begin to radicalize the right, and the Republican Party begins to move right in the 90s and keeps going. The Democrats don't radicalize yet, but in recent years they've shifted, especially since 2015, Democrats have shifted much further to the left. White Democrats in particular. So that's and then social media, that's the real kicker. That's what really just amplifies everything. And it wasn't very toxic in its first 5 years. In 2004, the Facebook, it wasn't polarizing. It was just, here are my friends, here are the bands that I like. But in 2009, they introduced the like button, the retweet button. They algorithmicized things based on engagement scores. So 2009 to 2011 is when social media really changes, becomes much more polarizing. And that's when the Russians realize, whoa, we don't have to send agents to America anymore. We can just sit here in St. Petersburg and mess with them. So that's number two, is changes to the media environment. Then the third factor that's really changed in our politics is that in recent years, the last 10 or 15, it's really become primarily about identity, not policy. So it used to be that what you thought about abortion was important, but now people think about politics as their identity, their group, their tribe, because the other side is so evil. As I know from social media or whatever, the other side is so evil, we've got to band together. And once things are a matter of identity, you can't compromise. That would be betraying your side. So that's what I would focus on. It's affective polarization, changes to media, and then politics as identity, not policy.
Well, so several of the things that you've talked about suggest that, such as the affective polarization, this tribalism, and the identity basis for it, these are factors that make America feel incredibly divided. And for Biden, President Biden, who's inaugurated tomorrow, he is coming in with an incredibly challenging, facing an incredibly challenging set of circumstances. That sense of division, but that sense of division also is reflected in the numbers. So President Trump got more votes than any previous presidential candidate ever has, got 46.8% of the popular vote as well. And we are still in the middle of a pandemic. The economy is definitely suffering. And there is that sense that there should be some punishment for what the other side has done. And that sense, I think, is kind of counterbalanced with in fact, President Biden has been promising to unify America. Mm-hmm. And so the question then becomes, what can business leaders do to help Biden with his promise of unification?
Okay, I guess I'll start with sort of like the big picture, and then Alison can get into more about what businesses can do specifically. So I would say first, it's important to note that the purpose of democracy is not unity. The purpose of democracy is to manage disputes with institutions and procedures that prevent violence, that prevent tribes from going at each other. So the mission isn't necessarily unity, but of course, after what we've been through and where we are, he's telegraphing a leadership style. As he said, he wants to be president for all Americans. So he wants to calm down the hatred, reduce the polarization, and get back to sort of normal order where people can compromise, we can work together. So I'm very pleased about that. And most Americans want that. But we are so polarized. I just saw an amazing statistic. Gallup just reported recently, Donald Trump will leave office with the lowest average approval rating of any president ever, including Nixon, but yet the highest average approval rating among Republicans, even higher than Reagan. And that's a sign of just how far apart left and right are. So what can business do? My main thought there would be that, because I've been studying polarization on college campuses, and I wrote a book with Greg Lukianoff, The Coddling of the American Mind, and we've seen academic communities torn apart by this increasing polarization. So I would say business should think about stop saying bring your whole self to work. That, I think, is a really, really bad idea, because what if my whole self hates your whole self, or at least hates your partisan identity? So I think we need to go back to the idea that you shouldn't bring your whole self to work. We are here to do something together, something great, something that's going to create an amazing product or serve our clients in amazing ways. Keep your focus on the mission and follow, like the Chicago principles. The University of Chicago made it very clear. We don't take sides on issues. We are a place, or a university, a platform where people can work things out. So in an analogous way, I think businesses should generally stay away from taking positions. Alison might disagree with me on this, but I think they should generally try to depoliticize things. And businesses can be the kind of place where people learn to work with those who have different political views without hating each other, because they have a larger overarching mission and identity. So I think businesses really could be like no combat zones or places where people can get to know each other. Alison, you've written a lot about employee activism in politics. What do you think?
Well, I love the idea of business depoliticizing, and I 100% agree that we all need to learn to work with people with very different values and beliefs than us. But I think we also need to acknowledge business has never been absent from politics. What in fact I think has been the situation is prior to around 2015, business's default position was we are politically neutral. Our political spending is a different story. And most businesses did also donate across the political spectrum, but with a weight towards deregulation. So what I think has changed is the use of business voice. So in a way, you start to see what was the implicit agenda of influencing politics becoming more explicit. That's had a lot of very problematic consequences for sure. But in a way, we are able to have a more transparent discussion about the degree to which what a business says and where it puts its money and its investments and who it does business with is consistent. So I think that's actually very positive. On the downside, I think the idea that businesses are like governments and their customers start to become like the electorate and their employees start to become like the electorate, that is incredibly damaging and dangerous, I think, for organizational culture and culture in America in general. But of course, business is not cut off from dynamics of society. So the trouble is now that if you try to take a neutral position and say we're just going to focus on our shareholders, one obvious example would be Uber, that carried on operating vehicles during the taxi driver strikes after the Trump quote unquote Muslim ban. They thought they were being neutral. They're just focusing on shareholder value. And that was perceived as a political move. And then this summer, the CEO of Coinbase said the same thing. We just want to stick to our mission. If employees don't like it, they can leave. And again, that kind of declaration of we are absent from politics caused a lot of problems. So the political middle ground is no longer a safe place to be. It's become an incredibly dangerous and risky place to be. Okay. So I think we're now in a reality where doing nothing is itself political.
Okay, but wait, so Alison, you're saying, so Coinbase got a lot of blowback, but maybe that's because they were one of the first to do it publicly. What if lots of companies or all the tech companies took that stand, and then, yes, they would, on a case-by-case basis, you might have to decide something, but do you think that would be a stable position if the general business community took that stand?
I mean, not anymore, right? Because tech in particular, if you thought about Twitter or Facebook right now saying, we're just going to focus on shareholder value, that's arguably the problem, right? So
okay, wait, but what if it's not about shareholder value? Because, what was it? A year and a half ago, we had the Business Roundtable saying we're all moving to stakeholder now. And then as soon as they say that, all hell breaks loose because stakeholders now have very passionate views about what the company should do. So what if it's not about shareholder primacy? What if companies are taking a stakeholder view?
Well, then the problem is stakeholders have political opinions and stakeholders demand that you take positions on climate change or immigration or whatever it might be. So I think stakeholder capitalism inherently asks for particular positions to be taken on corporate responsibility issues. There are arguably some that have less policy implications than others. You can advocate for reducing your carbon emissions, and that's a different thing from taking a position on immigration policy. Mm-hmm. So I also think you need to think issue by issue, but I'm not sure that we can go back to this idea of business being neutral. I'm not sure business was ever neutral. And I think we are in a position where we can have a better conversation about how business deploys its influence over politics, and hopefully start to address some of those contradictions and really beliefs that business is being very hypocritical. So the dynamics of transparency and media and social media exposure that you started with, I think, are very, very relevant here as well.
Okay, so if we bring in social media and what it's done to us, a lot of the tech companies, Google in particular, modeled their corporate culture on college. Everyone had a great time at university. And so they said, our campus is going to be like a college campus, and we have all these discussion groups and bring in all kinds of speakers. Well, guess what? A college campus isn't such a great place anymore. Or rather, I love being at NYU and at Stern. It's not really politicized. But overall, at liberal arts colleges, it's hard to have really open, transparent conversations because certain views will just, most of the elite schools lean to the left. Tech industry leans to the left. Media, journalism, nonprofits, probably most industries lean to the left, and the whole country, as it polarizes, many areas of business are becoming like college campuses, very much on the left. And so in an era of social media, it used to be you could have a conversation at your dorm or in a classroom, and there were communities and there were barriers and walls, and within those you could have a conversation. And what social media has done to us since 2009 or a little later is knock down all the walls. Everything is the public square, and anything you say could be broadcast widely. So I feel as though we can't speak on campus as much as we used to. We can't have open, transparent conversations as much as we used to. Do you think, is it the same in business? Is it the same that, if we talk about, if Uber would have a conversation about something about a Trump policy, would it be a transparent, open conversation?
Well, I think that's a really good question. And you certainly hear from employees and people on campus, for that matter, that they feel nervous about sharing their real opinions. But I don't think we can put this animal back in the box, if you're with me. I think now it is the case where really you have to open these conversations and have these conversations very openly and really involve your employees in how businesses position themselves on particular values, on particular social responsibility issues, on diversity and inclusion, and so on. So it's tempting to think if we just sort of shut all this down, all our problems will be solved. But unfortunately, I don't think that is the case, not least because we're in a brand new era for labor rights. I mean, Google, you mentioned, Google has just unionized. So I think we are we're entering a very interesting time for employee activism and labor rights in general. I don't think this is the end, given that it's the end of the Trump presidency. I think it might be the beginning of something as well. Yeah,
or maybe the end of the beginning, as Winston Churchill said.
Right.
Businesses have benefited enormously from the take your whole self to work. It is what makes people work long hours, engage, bring their creativity, really kind of engage with their coworkers as though they were almost family. And in fact, then their customers, sort of all of their stakeholders are showing stakeholders are showing that same level of engagement that makes them passionate and engaging with organizations beyond just using their products and services. And so I'm just wondering how much it feels like if we could find a way to create sort of guardrails or some rules of the road that enable these discussions to happen, that would allow us to take advantage of some of these benefits of bringing your whole self and engaging stakeholders more completely, but without ending up having business be just as polarized as our political debates are. So what would that even look like?
Yeah. Well, all three of us teach professional responsibility. We teach courses in that vein. And one thing I've learned since I came to Stern in 2011 and began teaching that course to all of our MBA students is that each profession or each domain has its own professional ethics. And so to be a journalist is to have a set of ethics that's different from a normal person acting with his friends. Doctors have ethics, lawyers have ethics, and business people have ethics. So I think within each of those contexts, you develop certain virtues and you develop what virtues that help you succeed in your mission, or I like to use the Greek word telos, or telos, which Aristotle talked about, like what is the goal or the end of this institution or this community. But if you encourage people to bring their whole self to work, what that means is this is just like the rest of life. So it's very hard to have any sort of professional ethics, because it's just the ethics of the public square, or the ethics of social media, or the ethics of your personal life with your friends. And I think that makes it very difficult to cultivate the ethics appropriate to the field. So again, I'm very skeptical. Now, you say businesses have profited. I'd like to introduce maybe one nuance there, is that maybe this worked well for the millennials. They were the ones who first wanted to bring their whole selves to work. But I think that people born after 1995, so Gen Z it's now called, at least what Lukyanov and I found, or what we say in the Coddling the American Mind, is that Gen Z is very different from the millennials. Much higher rates of anxiety, depression, self-harm, and suicide, much higher rates of fragility, and they seem to be more easily offended. It's not their fault. We argue that this is because we vastly overprotected them beginning in the 90s. We told them, the words, we stopped saying sticks and stones will break my bones. We started saying words are violence. So for a variety of reasons, it's not their fault, but Gen Z is different. And so what worked for the millennials, who are now, approaching 40, what worked for the millennials may be disastrous as Gen Z becomes a larger share of the working population. I don't know that that's true, but that would be my prediction. Alison, what do you think?
Well, I think, you do hear from people, right? I want to work for an organization that reflects my personal values. And I think that's a worthy goal. But clearly, a business cannot accurately reflect the personal values of all their employees. One of the points is we need more diversity, we need more inclusion, we need more broad perspectives. So I would say a few things. I think I would encourage business leaders to involve their employees in a discussion about what issues a company takes positions on. I would have a conversation about what the client acceptance policy or customer acceptance policy would be, rather than should we do business with this or that customer based on what I think. So I think you need to involve everybody in discussions about values, because we now are arguably in a new era of stakeholder capitalism, and employees have disproportionate influence, not least because they can leak and weaponize information onto social media. The other question about bringing your whole self to work, I agree with John. I think this has got out of hand. You now see situations where companies are both forcing their employees to work incredibly long hours and then providing counseling for the mental health problems that result. So you start to see this real kind of intrusion into people's personal lives. This is also coming up in the context of Me Too and sexual harassment, people needing to disclose their relationships. So we start to see business kind of moving in a very willing way into a very much more kind of personal relationship with their employees. I think the pandemic's brought that to a head. It has completely dissolved the boundaries between our personal and professional life. And I, for one, I think would quite like them back. And I think a lot of Gen Z and millennials would as well. So maybe the way to improve employees' mental health is to draw tighter boundaries between the professional and personal, give more time, give more trust, and try and create a more ethical culture that way. But I do think it's the sort of, we're curing diabetes rather than looking at the causes of diabetes in the first place. And I think, we may see somewhat of a recognition of that given everything that's happened. I certainly hope so.
Okay, so you say we need to have these conversations, and that's something that came up earlier in our discussion here. I would just urge that if you have these conversations in any sort of a way where people know who said what, then I can almost guarantee that a lot of people will be hiding what they feel, and it won't really be an honest conversation. So I think companies should have the conversations, but it's very important that they have a way, anonymous surveys or whatever, to find out what do people really think. Because this is happening all over the place. This is happening in our democracy, that social media in particular, so it's always been the case that the extremes are more passionate, more active, they vote in the primaries, and this is one of the biggest problems with American politics is most states have closed party primaries, so only the extremes are represented. And then cable TV and then social media has really amplified the voice of those extremes, and most Americans are very reasonable, they want to work together, but their voices have gone down. And it's the same thing in universities, except there's not really a right and a left. There's more just a left. So, and then the same thing in many companies, and there it's mostly left. But you'll also then have, the right coming out in ways that are sometimes very offensive because they're really kind of angry, and if you make anonymous ways for people to comment, you kind of sometimes get some ugly stuff. But my point is, any company that's going to have these discussions should be sure they have a way of actually surveying what people believe, because it will probably differ a lot from what is said publicly. And I've just put in 2 plugs. One is at Ethical Systems. So our whole purpose at Ethical Systems is to make business ethics a cumulative science. When I came to Stern in 2011, there was so much to learn about about ethics in organizations, and I was coming from the study of moral psychology, and it was clear that while there's research in business schools, it tends to use MBA students. It's hard to get into companies. So the whole purpose of Ethical Systems is to actually first combine all the research, make it all accessible. What do we know? And then second, do new research to figure out what works. And so we have a culture survey at Ethical Systems. We have a Speak Up culture survey. So we have tools that you can use to actually measure your culture to see where things are. And the other product I would suggest is Open Mind. If you go to openmindplatform.org, it's a training program that I developed with Caroline Mell to basically teach principles of moral and social psychology within groups so that groups can have better discussions. So tools are out there.
Yeah, and 100%. And the other thing to say here is that many of the culture challenges we're having today are unprecedented. Companies like to benchmark, and they like to hire consultants that benchmark and tell them what best practice is, and then they do best practice. Unfortunately, whether it is culture in a remote work environment, whether it is speaking up, whether it is managing these very challenging diversity and inclusion dynamics, whether it is deciding what social issues to take positions on, there is not really a body of thought telling you what to do. So I think that does mean less benchmarking and more about figuring out how your organization is going to position itself and what its values look like and that kind of thing. I think that has to be a collaborative effort. It's historically been a very top-down effort, but we're starting to see a lot of hierarchical conflict. Very often either social and environmental issues or diversity and inclusion issues are the vehicle for that conflict. But we're really in uncharted territory in terms of corporate culture. So lots to learn and nothing really to draw on right now.
Yeah, no, that's right. Uncharted waters is really right. There is a body of work out there that gives people advice. There's a huge leadership literature, which is often unmoored from any kind of research. It's just people saying what they thought worked. So there is a body out there, and there's also a lot of research done over the last 30 or 40 years. But you might think of it as if there was a management textbook written in 2007. Summarizing everything we know about how to have a good corporate culture, how to lead. And now, given all we've been through from the financial crisis through the social media era, the George Floyd protests, and the pandemic, and given all we've been through, we still have this textbook, but we have no idea which chapters are still legitimate. I mean, it's probably the case that a third to a half of it is no longer accurate. Actually, Batia, so you've been teaching in our management area for a long time. I mean, what do you think about whether because some of our audience here might have gotten an MBA 10, 20 years ago. What do you think about how much of the knowledge in management is still valid from 15, 20 years ago?
I mean, I definitely think that one of the things we haven't yet talked about in terms of uncharted territory, but we do have a lot of research on, is what remote work means.
Oh, yeah, you've done some of that work.
The change in the structure of the relationship between the relationship between employees and organizations is a very different one, where people are kind of taking charge of their own careers. There's much more of a gig culture, and that is, I think, really creating some challenges. I think that some challenges about, like, what even does, when we think about leadership, we think so much of it is associated with things like charisma, but is charisma communicated the same way and is it as powerful? Is that what people are looking for when they're in a remote context? And it's interesting because so much, I mean, all this activism, corporate activism and now employee activism, it was kicked off by CEO activism, and who kind of saw it largely as part of the way that they saw themselves. And that's what it means for a CEO in some ways, to bring their whole self to work. But it's very interesting to think about how many of these things probably don't operate in the same way in a remote work context. And I guess I'm wondering whether you folks see, I mean, especially since your focus is going to be on things like corporate culture and creating ethical cultures. We know, I mean, for example, in the educational setting, there have been real challenges that the online context in many ways frees people up to engage in behaviors that would otherwise be considered slacking or cheating or, kind of a whole variety of different behaviors with varying levels of ethicality. And I just wonder what you guys think about how these structural changes that we may never go back to the way it was pre-pandemic, but how do these kinds of structural changes alter what you're looking at, and what you think is going to be required for organizations to navigate going forward this polarized environment?
Yeah. Well, Alison, why don't you take it? You've been studying the effects of work from home.
Yeah, so lots in what you said, Batia, I completely agree with. I think the role of charisma and the role of office politics in a remote work environment is completely fascinating. Since the beginning of the pandemic, lots of predictions that fraud and unethical conduct would skyrocket. That has led to the increasing use of employee surveillance, which is another topic with a very potentially very negative impact on organizational culture. But one thing that has definitely happened is that whistleblowing has skyrocketed. The SEC put data out last week because if your boss isn't looming over you, it's far easier to report them for unethical behavior. So I think the salience of charisma and office politics and socialization, all those things, when we start a new job, we don't figure out how to behave from reading the code of conduct. We figure out how to behave from looking at the people around us and looking at what is rewarded and valued and salient. That's not there anymore. So the value, I think, of competence, of communication, I hope of ethical leadership becomes much higher. John's right. There have been a lot of people talking about what ethical leadership ought to look like, and the behavior we reward and valorize is arguably at odds with that. But I think whether we go fully back to the office or not, I do think we're in this era where from a combination of the activism we've talked about and remote work, there is a different model and different skills needed for leaders today. I find that very exciting, but it's certainly got some downsides for the leaders themselves or some new challenges.
Yeah,
so
and I think Oh, yeah. So I think one of the downsides is going to be that it's going to be a lot harder, I think, for companies to have a culture. So I've studied cultural psychology early in my career, and I've read a lot of anthropology. And people are very, very good at working themselves into a culture, and they're very, very good at code switching. So, you see this even in kids. They learn one way to behave at home, and they can be totally different at school. Right. So we're I think we've evolved to be really sensitive to how do people do things around here. And so, before the pandemic, you could have a company culture and because it's all around you for 8 hours a day solid, you really get into the culture. And that might never happen again for some companies. I think it's going to be very hard if people are sitting at home and they're always switching and they're talking to their kids or they're out shopping or, I think it's going to be very, companies have put so much effort into having great cultures. And I think that's going to be very hard going forward. What do you think, Alison?
I just think it needs to be a much more deliberate effort. And it probably means that we will see, increasingly companies trying to differentiate themselves and position themselves on questions of values and maybe questions with political implications. So I think the perception that all this corporate activism is just a Trump era issue is not correct.
Right.
I mean, we can think about our companies as a collective hallucination in a way. This is something that we need to believe in order. And if we can't see that culture, I think leaders will use different mechanisms to try and create that sense of groupishness. So I don't think that's very good news, John, for your hope that business will become less political. I would rather see more differentiation on questions of values and questions of positioning, at least in the short term, until everyone realizes how many unintended consequences there are to all this.
Okay, wait, but Alison, so we hear about tech companies saying, or various companies saying, you know what, you can live wherever you want. Like, you don't have to come back to San Francisco. So assuming that a lot of companies do this and have a lot of people that are remote, often very far away, do you think they're making a mistake? Or can they compensate for this by having like 3 or 4, offsite, everybody comes together in Hawaii, twice a year for a week? I mean, do you think that they're making a mistake in thinking that you can just let people, it's efficient, let them live where they want?
I mean, I think, again, it's a little bit of a slippery slope. Now it's out there. It's very hard to say, no, you're all going to come back physically to the office and start commuting again. So again, it's kind of negative and positive consequences, but definitely big consequences. So I think it will be hard in at least kind of white collar office jobs to insist that everyone is in the office 5 days a week from now on, because employees will vote with their feet. A lot of people do want to work flexibly. A lot of people also miss that culture and miss the opportunity to socialize with people. It certainly makes management harder. You can't pull people aside casually. You have to set up a Zoom meeting and have a formal conversation. So I don't think we're going to return to the status quo. I think the pandemic has accelerated a lot of dynamics that were going on anyway. But now I think what we need to do is figure out how to create and model culture under very, very different and much more challenging conditions. So lots and lots of complexity here, but I don't think it's an option to just sidestep that complexity, sadly.
We have so many great questions in the chat, and they're on a bunch of different topics. So I'm thinking that maybe let's turn to some of the questions in the chat. One of them was one of the questions that we had discussed earlier, which is about what does it take to create trust? And I guess this sort of occurs at multiple levels, and sort of, are we imagining, and this touches on a number of other questions, are we imagining that corporations are going to be kind of either defined politically, like it's, this one is a left, this one is a right? Can we imagine corporations that can we imagine a situation in which there is that type of polarization? Is that a path to trust? Are there other mechanisms that we have a crisis of trust where people don't trust the government, and they, in fact, at least in a poll in December, they're trusting businesses more than the government, but they're still losing faith in institutions. And so what is it going to take to create that sense of trust that enables these institutions to move forward?
Yeah, it's a global problem. Certainly in Western countries, the decline of trust in institutions, more so in America than say in Northern Europe. So it certainly is not the same everywhere. But I think, just speaking as a social psychologist, I believe that humans are not intrinsically selfish, they're intrinsically groupish. We're really good at forming groups, but we're careful about it. We're not just going to be drawn into any group. And so, in fact, the word corporation literally means body. I mean, a corporation was a legal mechanism developed by the Dutch and the English so that people could, bring together their capital, or, you could create something made out of people. So, so trust, I think, has always been important for the corporate form, and of course, many companies have failed to do that. Just a couple of general principles. So, shared fate is a big one. There's a really powerful mental state of one for all for one. And people who've been in battle often have this really intense bonding to the people that they were in battle with. So, but the idea that the ups and the downs, you ride it together. And we often hear these stories of great leadership, and Japanese leaders. I remember from years ago, when times are bad, they would take a huge pay cut with their employees, and some American companies do that, but many don't. So I think if leaders have to work harder now to inspire trust, I think really being more explicitly linking their fortunes to so everyone goes up together and down together. Everyone's got skin in the game. People feel that. People feel that they're all in it together, and also that they feel heard. It's very important. A strong sense of procedural fairness. That's always important. So that doesn't mean fairness in distribution. It means people have faith that however distributions or bonuses, whatever, however things are divided, the process is fair and transparent, and my concerns have been heard, and then they're much more likely to accept the outcome, even if it's an adverse outcome. Alison, what would you add?
I would add, I think the concern is hypocrisy, right? Trust dissolves when there is a perception that leaders say one thing and do something else, and that there is impunity. I think for various reasons, that is also all being kind of shot to bits. So the issue is tackling hypocrisy. One, you see that in the context of the companies saying one thing about what they believe and spending money that indicates something else. And you've seen this huge blow up in what's happening on political donations in the last couple of weeks. The other thing I think is that we need to rethink business ethics. Ethics as an academic discipline is about social psychology, or it's about philosophy. Ethics in a business context is about compliance and human resources and sustainability. All of those are functions designed to protect the organization from legal or reputational risk. They don't have much to do with each other, and they are tools to deflect risk, from the organization. They don't have very much to do with ethics. So I think we need to think about what it takes to be an ethical organization. I think we need to bring the conversations together between things like diversity, inclusion, and sustainability. Compliance doesn't work unless it is reflected in the culture. We need to think about the incentives. John's just spoken about the incentives. People will not trust you if CEO pay is, by many, many, many multiples higher than the average employee. So I think there's a lot to be done. I don't think businesses can throw their hands up and say we can't do anything about this. I just think we need to stop thinking about legal and regulatory risk and start thinking about business ethics and what that actually means.
So we've got a bunch of questions here that are asking about social media companies, the tech companies, social media companies in particular, and sort of what is their responsibility, specifically thinking about what their ethical and even risk, what you were talking about, Alison, the risks that what are their responsibilities to society, to their shareholders, and it's interesting because arguably Trump is maybe being canceled when we think about what's happening with Shopify, sort of shutting down some of these units, to what Twitter has done. And I wonder if you could comment on the social media companies and what the expectations, should they be regulated? What should be our expectations for that particular sector, since you implicated them right from the beginning?
John.
Yeah. So, we have a well-developed body of law and understanding about newspapers and publishers with editors, and they have all kinds of responsibilities, and they often have an ombudsperson to, they've got to find the truth. So we have we understand that, and then we also understand the phone company. And we would never hold the phone company liable for a conversation that happened on the telephone. And the social, I don't know what the origin of this, but I presume they argued for being treated like the telephone company. They acted like we're just a neutral platform. People say all kinds of things. And I think what's become increasingly clear is that they're not one or the other. They're somewhere in the middle. And we don't have a clear set of laws or understandings or frameworks to think about that. So we're sort of feeling that out, and moderation is emerging as sort of the main thing. Like, okay, you're not responsible for everything, but you got to be trying. And if something is called to your attention, you have to, shut it down or label it, and in extreme cases, kick someone off. So, I think that in principle, the decision to revoke Donald Trump, to revoke his activities on Twitter, I think is actually probably quite reasonable, or at least that's the kind of thing that I think should probably be done. But, and there are a lot of asterisks here, it has to be done in a way that is viewpoint neutral. That is, it's not just that most people are on the left and so they censor people on the right harsher. That's going to be very hard to avoid. So it should be viewpoint neutral. There should be a consistency in principles that are stated up front. There should be some sort of due process and appeal. And so I think all of these things are possible, although they'll be very difficult given the huge volume. I think it is kind of funny. I was listening to a podcast of Blocked and Reported with Katie Herzog and oh gosh, why am I blocking on his name? At any rate, they were talking about all the platforms that Trump has been barred from. And it's not just Twitter and Shopify refusing. There's like 15, including Twitch, like, things that he would never be on. These places have said, no, we will not handle, we will not handle any of Donald Trump. So yes, in a sense, he's being canceled, and people can decide whether that is a delicious irony or an outrage.
Yeah. So we've got several, sort of in that same spirit, several questions that are basically asking if you have guidance for Biden or for our political leaders. So is there anything that, what can Biden do to kind of handle this polarization that seems to be emerging? Is there a way to separate identity from politics? We've gone down that road. So I'm just looking at a few different kind of angles on this question. Would we expect that once Biden is inaugurated, that business leaders will be able to kind of back off? What would they be looking for Biden to do that would allow them to kind of pull back a little bit and not have as high levels of activism? So kind of a bunch of questions in that regard. Yeah. And I wonder if you two could comment on anything that you want to with regard to the sort of recommendations for alleviating the political side.
Okay, I'll start with the political side, and then Alison can do more of the business side. I think we generally, or Americans or Westerners, tend to think like, okay, what should the leader say, and how should he lead? But we are now so polarized, and we live in such radically different information ecosystems that Biden can give the most beautiful address in the world, and it's not going to suddenly win people over, especially because it's a matter of identity. It's not as you can persuade people. So I would focus a lot less on what he should say, and I would focus a lot more on reforms that would drain some of the poison out of our system. And so that means we desperately need reforms to how we run elections, how we do redistricting, rules of Congress. There are a lot of things that are set up that really amplify the polarization. So the worst number of political parties to have in a country is clearly 1. Okay, 1 is a terrible number of political parties, but the second worst number is 2. And that's what we have, because that maximizes the degree to which we go into us versus them. Of course, in Europe, they have parliamentary systems that have their own problems, but they're not as polarized as we are. So I think that some reforms that make it more, that reduce the incentives or the rewards for being an extreme partisan in the Republican or Democratic Party, but rather open it up for candidates who aren't exactly that. Now, granted, Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders weren't prototypical, but they were kind of extreme on a left-right. Well, they were extreme in their own ways. So I just read an analysis of HR 1, House, the bill that the House might introduce as the number one, the first bill, and it's about automatic voter registration. So increasing the number of people who vote, a more participatory democracy, redoing how electoral districts are drawn, which is a travesty. That it's a political process in most states is just a travesty. That politicians get to pick their voters don't get to pick their politicians. So there's a whole set of structural reforms to elections and congressional behavior. The media environment is incredibly important, but we're more limited there because of First Amendment and issues. It's hard, but antitrust regulation. So should they be regulated? I think probably the clearest case is just antitrust. If if there are huge bars to entry for anyone else, there certainly is reason to investigate that. And I think is it Thomas Philippon? We have a faculty member here at Stern who's been writing about how America, more than Europe, America has really allowed gigantic mega companies that have little competition.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would add only campaign finance reform. I think if I were Biden, I would focus on trying to clarify that relationship between business and politics. And companies maybe didn't want that before, but now that everything is on the table and everybody is looking very closely at the gap between what they say and where they spend money, I think that's right. And that might actually be a relief. And then there's bipartisan support for measures that reduce corruption and increase transparency.
Yes.
A bill passed just before Christmas, or maybe just after, ending anonymous companies. One of the interesting things about our very polarized political environment in America is that both sides think the other side is irredeemably corrupt.
Yes.
So there's actually bipartisan support for anti-corruption measures that would have very good international implications and is really, really long overdue. So that is not kind of taking aim directly at polarization, but I think that would take the pressure off businesses a little bit and allow them to hopefully try and carve out that middle ground where they would really ideally like to be. Businesses in general don't like to make a lot of noise about rule of law and corruption. They'd rather make lots of noise about climate change and good jobs and that kind of thing. But you saw in the run up to the latest election, more and more businesses giving people time off to vote. So I think that supports for the democratic process and the rule of law, it's not been a very fashionable corporate activism topic till now. There was recent data from Bloomberg talking about who's doing what on the SDGs, and SDG 16, which is about corruption and the rule of law, is definitely the neglected stepchild of the SDGs. Now would be a really good time for businesses to put some effort and heft behind that, not for their own interests, but for a level playing field. So that's what I'm going to push for.
So there are a number of questions that are focused on what the underlying issues that might be driving polarization would be, and implicating, it seems like, factors like inequality and the sort of underlying societal issues. I can't tell, in some cases the questions are sort of implicating businesses in creating some of those, and in some cases just simply kind of speaking to those issues. And I wonder whether there are, whether you have any comments on what you think. I mean, I feel like it's related to what Alison was just now talking about. What might be some of the underlying factors that could be creating the polarization that we're seeing?
Sure, and I'd be glad to speak to that. I gave my list of sort of the three big ones, but there's a lot more that are also quite important. So I'll just list them, and then Alison can add what she wants. I wrote a paper, an essay on this with Sam Abrams, a political scientist, and we listed 10 big ones. And so one is nothing brings people together like a major war against a perfectly evil adversary. And so the World War II generation, the greatest generation, anybody who remembers World War II, especially if they were young, they were just much better at cooperating. And that's what we saw in the political class up until the 90s. Famously, Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill could, put aside their differences and enjoy a drink together in the evening. Well, the baby boomers, they grew up not fighting Nazis, they grew up fighting each other. And so once Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton came in, just their generation. So we lost the greatest generation. That's one. Another is the loss of a common enemy because it didn't, the war didn't end when Hitler was defeated. We then went right to the Soviets. And so we had a long Cold War. And that also kept Americans together, as defenders of democracy and the free world. We had a really virtuous mission, and we knew who we were. And of course, thank God the Soviet Union fell, but a consequence has been we're not kept together as much. Another one is diversity. To the extent that you have everyone feels that they are the same people, same language, same religion, you tend to have more trust. A diverse society is more dynamic in many ways. There are a lot of advantages, but cohesion and trust are not in that set. Another one is education. People who don't have a college degree are more focused on pocketbook issues, which you can compromise on and you can be practical about. They're not as focused on, abortion or bathroom policies. That's more for the sort of the college-educated elite. And our culture war now is sort of between it's actually been called the white civil war, because it's highly educated people on the left, college degree people on the left, and on the far right, actually, they actually are not as uneducated as people think. So it's sort of, educated white people in particular really engage with sort of culture war issues. So there's a lot going on that we have to push against if we want to return to having a functioning democracy.
I would just add, I think, there's an argument that business has played a role in getting us to this situation as well. There was a very good column by Martin Wolf in the Financial Times recently talking about this in the context of Milton Friedman. But really, I don't think we had a reckoning after the 2008 financial crisis. We, since then have seen spiraling inequality. We've seen a lot of anger. And I think business has played its part in all of that. And so I go back to the same points about, we need to look at corporate governance. This debate about stakeholder capitalism, I think, is just rhetoric unless there are those kind of more concrete mechanisms to make that happen. I don't know that this will clearly be divisive in the very short term, but I do think that, the goal is that business should be as involved in politics as little as possible, and we should have a functioning democratic process. We're not there, but I think we need to start trying to rebuild or get back to that position.
Here's an interesting question I wanted to pose to you, and it is the contrast between ethical organizations and purpose-driven organizations. And so there definitely is, there's definitely a lot of talk about purpose-driven organizations. And it feels like that talk about purpose-driven organizations opens the door to higher levels of employee activism, CEO activism, et cetera. Is there a dividing line between those two? What do they each mean?
I have to admit, I'm not 100% clear that anybody really agrees on what purpose actually is. It's a new fashionable topic. There's a lot of money to be made helping companies understand or identify their purpose. People are very, very enthusiastic about the idea of purpose. I have to say I'm not 100% clear what it is. I do think if what we mean is setting intentions, making written commitments, having principles, not just rules, that is very, very important. So if you are going to say, I support the UN Guiding Principles on Human Rights, that can't just be a policy statement. You actually have to measure your human rights impacts and do something about that. There is a tendency for companies to take policy positions without putting human beings behind them to make that happen. So in that sense, I guess I would argue that an ethical organization and a purpose-driven organization can be the same thing. I do think that what companies need to do is far more deliberately set their goals and principles, get away from the cliches, define their character, write it out, and then implement it. So I would hope for a convergence between an ethical and a purpose-driven organization. But perhaps I'm too much of a skeptic about the word purpose.
So maybe we can take the last minute for sort of last words from each one of you. Maybe we can start with you, John. Any last words you want to leave us with?
Yeah, I would say it's a very exciting time to be a social scientist and a very exciting time to be studying business and society. So we have a great area, the Business and Society program, of which Batia is the chair. And so if people on the call are interested in going to graduate school, think about Stern. If you are running a business, check out our website and our offerings for the department, and also ethicalsystems.org. And the final point is that when things seem rather dark, when it looks as though our country is in trouble in a lot of ways, just remember that it's always been wrong to bet against America. And the odds are that 10 years from now, things will be a lot better and we'll emerge stronger from this. I don't quite see how we get there, but the odds are we will.
Alison?
I mean, this is just an incredibly exciting moment to be working on business ethics and culture and these questions. So I would just say we're in a period of incredibly rapid change. I think that having an ethical culture is one of the biggest sources of competitive advantage a business can have right now. And so now is the moment to focus on these questions and tackle them and not hope that you can sweep them under the carpet. It's too late for that, but there is a lot of advantage, a lot of motivation to be gained here. I've just been teaching professional responsibility, in fact, and there's a huge difference between the students that really have kind of doubled down on admiration and support for their employers during the pandemic, usually because what they've done on healthcare and layoffs and that kind of thing, and others who are really, really turned off by what their employers have done and really are feeling very, very demotivated. So that's my biggest real-time indication that this stuff really matters.
Thank you both so much for a very illuminating first webinar. Note that everyone can watch the video recording of this. It'll be available on the BSP website in a couple of days. And tune in next month for Tansy Whalen and Jeffrey Hollander talking about the Biden administration's agenda on climate change. Thank you all and good night.